again, everyone, we're going to get started with our final session of today on Track 3, latest in cyber tools and techniques. Just a couple of announcements. So like I mentioned, this is the last session of this track, and there is no EndNote presentation today. A survey link will be sent to your email following the summit, and so please take some time, fill it out, tell us what you think. And just a reminder in this room that the sessions here are being live streamed and recorded. And so with that, I'm going to introduce our next speaker and our final speaker. Our next speaker is the founder of PA Hackers, cybersecurity practice lead for the Appalachia Technology, and avid hacker and cybersecurity leader here in Central PA. Brandon Keith will be presenting on why compliance won't save you, focusing on what matters. So Brandon, welcome.
It's always great to be last. You know, because some people have left, so if I completely bomb, there's not as many people here to see it. So I have some statistics up on the board. And what you can see is these statistics are, I pulled some of these from what I had last year, but a lot of them are still fairly accurate. Every 39 seconds, there's a cyber attack. Profits for cyber criminals are over $1.5 trillion per year. That's greater than most industries. The cyber criminals are raking in money hand over fist right now. Everyone has seen it in the news. Ransomware is getting worse, or at least the media is showing it all the time. And $15 billion is estimated as the federal budget for cybersecurity in 2019. $15 billion to stop the theft of over $1.5 trillion. Security breaches have increased by 67% over the last 5 years. How did that happen? Because we have these compliance frameworks and a lot of these regulations that, from a certain perspective, it looks like more organizations are following these standards than ever. So today, we're going to talk about compliance and regulations, and we're going to talk about where they help a lot in cybersecurity strategy and areas where they sometimes fail. Compliance is not the end-all, be-all answer. We're going to give some examples of where compliance fails, and then we're going to talk about a couple different hacking tools, because I love doing a fun technical demo, and we're going to talk about these tools and how compliance doesn't have a really good way of dealing with the advances of how fast these offensive operations and these advanced threats change. And we're going to talk about detecting some of these threats in your environments. And then we're going to bring it all together because Brandon had a spelling error. So what is regulatory compliance? Well, it's an organization's adherence to laws, regulations, guidelines, and specifications relevant to business, processes, etc. So it could be a law, it could be a standard. For example, PCI is a standard by the credit card companies. They came together to create that standard. There's not a federal law for PCI compliance, but if you do credit cards and you work with credit card companies, you have to follow the PCI DSS guidelines. In other cases, there's mandates and laws based off state, local, federal, and international laws all over that have different compliance requirements. For healthcare, we hear a lot about HIPAA. For education, we hear a lot about FERPA. There's probably an acronym for every single compliance framework out there. But here's some interesting stats I pulled off. There's some boards and bodies that deal with compliance, and they cover kind of compliance across industries. They do some surveys to companies to ask, how are you doing with your compliance? And 90% of chief compliance officers report their board or committee is adequately informed of compliance risk and mitigation efforts. That's a stark comparison when we talk about cybersecurity. Are people informed of risks? Because oftentimes we talk about compliance and risk, and how management isn't properly informed on risk. But according to surveys, 90% say they are. 94% of organizations report that requirements are embedded within their policies and procedures. And 84% say they have a compliance risk assessment process. Well, risk assessment often falls under cybersecurity. Risks to your organization fall under that risk assessment process. And 81% of organizations report having a data breach response plan in place. That's a stark comparison to what we see or what we think in industry. If all of these compliance requirements are being met by the majority of organizations, then why are we still having so many breaches? Why are we still finding a lot of the simple security standards still aren't being met if we're meeting all the compliance standards? And the reason is compliance does not equal security. Just because you're compliant does not mean you're secure. Compliance fails in many areas. One of the things compliance frameworks do is they take a while to update. PCI DSS, using that as an example again, switched to a point system update. So they're doing updates every year. But threats can change daily. Sometimes threats will change monthly, but sometimes you find out the day there's a new 0 day that affects your environment. There's no compliance or regulatory body. Just because you're compliant doesn't mean you're going to be secure. Compliance can be implemented the wrong way. I talk about a lot of this when we talk about software development, and we hear about segregating environments, having a dev environment and a test environment and a production environment, and making sure things are segregated. But the joke among developers is often that we're testing in production. And I've seen this in an environment where what they would do is they would take the development code, they'd push it to test, they immediately push the test code directly into production without any real testing. But when they get an audit done and the auditor asks, do you have segregated development, test, and production environments? Yes, we do. We do. Do you push to those environments? Yes, we do. Oh, wow, you guys are way ahead. You guys are doing a lot here. But behind the scenes, we're really just going through the motions. We're not really testing and doing security. A lot of companies will do the very bare minimum to get by on compliance. When GDPR first was released, I mean, that was a big thing. Do you know what companies did because they didn't know how to deal with European data? News outlets in the US started blocking all IP addresses from Europe. So instead of adhering to the new laws, they said, we're not going to spend money on adhering to new laws. We're going to block commerce and all the IPs from Europe. We're just not going to do business in Europe. I guarantee you the people that were sitting down the committee that helped develop GDPR never thought, do you think this could stunt economic growth with this regulatory compliance? No, the entire intention behind it was that, hey, we need organizations to be responsible for their data and their privacy and the data they hold. That was the intent. A lot of compliance requirements have good intents. PCI DSS wants to make sure you're following all the proper standards to make sure you don't get breached, right? When credit card numbers get breached, it costs credit card companies a lot of money. A lot of the compliance frameworks and stuff around NIST and FedRAMP, a lot of that is making sure, hey, we want to make sure we're meeting at least the baseline cybersecurity standards to stop a breach or some type of cyber attack from happening. No one wants the electric power plants blowing up, the water getting contaminated, or their personal information being stolen. But all of those things have happened in some cases. So compliance can be subjective too, because sometimes a compliance framework is very broad. So just because there's a requirement doesn't mean that it's always interpreted the most secure way. Again, going back to our dev, test, and prod example, it's a prime example. And it looks good on paper. A company can look very good on paper if it has lots of policies and procedures. But in reality, a lot of people might not be following the policies and procedures. Maybe you have a policy people aren't supposed to put a sticky note with their password and tape it under their keyboard. But just because it's a policy doesn't mean people can't break it. So I find it interesting, more companies are trying to meet these compliance standards than ever, but 67% increase in breaches. It just doesn't work. So what does it really take to make an organization secure if compliance doesn't work? And I'm not saying compliance isn't a good part of it. It forces a lot of companies and organizations to make commitments, and in some cases it helps get a lot of state, local, and other organizations revenue. It can help you justify it to management executives, right? We have to meet this compliance, so I really need a budget for cybersecurity. That can be a tough conversation. But that can't be where it ends. What it really takes is, again, and we talk about this all the time, we got to focus on people, processes, and technology. So what do we have to do with our people? And I talk about this a lot. It starts with culture. We have to build a culture of people that care about security. You have to make it personal with people. This is important both for in your organization at work, but also at home. Do you get phished at work and at home, or just one? It's everywhere. People are being targeted both at employment and in their personal lives. It should be personal for everyone to take cybersecurity seriously at this point. It's not a buzzword. This is a new reality we live in with the digital age. People tend to be the main targets for cybercriminals. Why? People are unpredictable. Technology, that can be predictable. A lot of that's based on math. We can figure out some things. There's some abnormalities, but in general, we can control technology. One of the greatest mistakes we ever did in IT was get this idea, what if we let people choose their own passwords? That'll be good, right? We added an abnormality into our system that we could never predict. The first people who invented the concept of a password, I'm sure, never thought someone would use the password of password. Yet it's still rampant. Or perhaps even more so than the word password is winter 2019 or spring 2018. I see that in organizations all the time. They use that. They'll use a very standard procedure for giving passwords out for default accounts, and it can come back to hurt organizations in the long run. So people are unpredictable. So this is an area that often we focus on. We talk about this all the time, phishing and training in organizations, because that's a main target. Processes. A lot of this is where compliance start to come in. Frameworks, policies, procedure, compliance requirements, checklists. Do you have an action plan? If there's a breach, is there a book or guidelines on what to do if a certain asset is compromised? And how far does that go? Is it very generalized or is it very specific? If you see these number of Windows ID events and they correlate to this, do this. You can get very technical and specific with your response, or you can be very broad. The more specific you get, the easier it will be to respond, but the more time consuming it will be. So maybe 84% of companies do have an incident response plan. But how many of those companies just have a title page? Or something that they pulled out as a generic template that they filled in a couple things without really understanding their response plan. Focusing on processes and making sure they're followed right is a big step we can take to making sure our organizations are safer. And technology. This is a big one because this is a moving target. Threats can change daily. What worked today might not work tomorrow. For those who remember, I'm not sure if anyone remembers a couple years ago, does anyone remember the crack vulnerability? Show of hands, does anyone remember that one? For those who don't remember, the crack vulnerability was an issue in several Wi-Fi routers. It was in the WPA2 standard that was discovered, and when it was released, it allowed people to intercept Wi-Fi communications and potentially decrypt that information. So in one day, it potentially made all Wi-Fi unsafe. At that time, I worked for a very large multi-billion-dollar organization, and we had a lot of sensitive data going over Wi-Fi. We did what any billion-dollar organization would do. We literally turned down our Wi-Fi signal because we had Wi-Fi signal that reached very far outside our building, so we did what we could to mitigate the threat and encourage people to not use Wi-Fi until we could address the threat. There were certain patches that weren't released, and we had to wait several days for those patches to release. We had to respond because for that organization, it wasn't acceptable that any Wi-Fi traffic could be intercepted. For many people, if you weren't working directly in incident response and cybersecurity, you may not have even know that happened. This is how threats can change every day. And today's threats become tomorrow's realities. Maybe it's a threat today, but maybe tomorrow it becomes a bigger issue. And technology gaps can sometimes be overlooked. This is a complex area. So how many people here are familiar with Active Directory? A fair number of people. For those who haven't used Active Directory much, it's a Microsoft technology. It runs on Windows systems. It can run on Linux now as well. And it stores all of the information about your computer systems and users on your network. Maybe only some basic information about your computer systems, but every time you log in with your username and password, it's going to authenticate to Active Directory. It's also going to control all of your privileges on the network, what you can have access to and you don't. Why is this important? Because every organization has it. What does that mean? Well, it's a prime target for being abused. Because if you know every organization has it, then a bad guy can potentially take advantage of it. So one hacker tool I want to talk about is this tool called Bloodhound. And it's a tool for enumerating Active Directory. And with a single user account, potentially a non-privileged account, figuring out what an Active Directory environment in an organization looks like. This is an open source tool that was released in 2015. I can't remember if it was Black Hat or DEF CON, but it was one of those, and it's been massively growing as an open source tool and is actively used as a way to break into networks. But it can also be used for defensive purposes as well, and we'll see exactly how that looks like. So here's a sample environment of what Bloodhound might look like. Now, in this environment, we can do a lot of things after we've collected information. We can run all kinds of queries to return information. If we want to find all the domain admins on the network, there we go. Maybe we want to find the shortest path to gaining a domain admin. It will figure out and tell us, and you'll notice here, you see a bunch of devices that says has session. It will actually enumerate which user accounts are logged into different computers. Why is that important? Well, there's another tool, and we'll talk about here in a second, that if you log into a computer, say you remote desktop into a server, your credentials could be living in the RAM or memory of that computer system. Now, what an adversary can do is they can then dump those credentials if they get access to that system. Now we're beginning to see this is how a lot of breaches occur. It starts with one computer system. If you dump all of the credentials from that system, maybe you go from 1 user account to 4 user accounts. Now I can start to hit more user accounts. Now, if you are an advanced persistent threat, which used to just be China and Russia, but now it kind of extends to a lot of the cyber criminal organizations. They're getting pretty advanced and sophisticated. It's a $1.5 trillion industry. they're doing these things too. And Bloodhound isn't the only tool that does it, but it certainly gives you a nice visual representation of the different things you can do. And the other thing you can do is you can list what credentials you've gained for an account. So if you list a specific computer that an adversary has taken control over, you can actually see how far or how many computers you would have to hack to get to a domain admin. Well, for those of us who are familiar with Active Directory, a domain admin is an administrative account who has access to all the computers on your network with the highest privileges, which means they can steal pretty much any sensitive information or control any of the computers that are connected to that network. It's pretty dangerous. But this kind of tool, that isn't something that a compliance framework is really going to deal with. You really have to be monitoring this stuff in real time. And in general, does anyone really know how many sessions are on each computer or is tracking where those credentials are living? That can change fairly quickly. So if you're not using a tool to figure out where sessions are, you may think you're all right, but if a high privilege user happens to log in to do administration on a computer, their credentials could be living in memory. In response to this, one of the things Microsoft said, and some of you may have read it because some of the NIST documentation references this, is they say for systems administrators, they should have a separate computer for doing administrative tasks versus a normal computer for doing regular tasks. The reason that suggestion is in there, because a lot of people are like, why do I have to buy 2 computers for my systems administrator? This is really confusing. Is for this reason specifically, so that if your standard user computer that you use every day for regular tasks versus your administrative or systems administrator account gets compromised, that your password isn't living in that computer, so it doesn't get compromised. This is something I see a lot when I'm doing penetration tests, is that we find a lot of computers with a multitude of credentials sitting together on one computer. Normally we'll find a gold mine like a file server that just has 50 credentials sitting in it because no one ever restarts the file server. But this is a threat. So how do you detect Bloodhound? Because you can detect it and you can stop it. And how do you detect tools like Bloodhound? Well, one of the things you can do is look for event ID 4662. How many people here have dealt with event ID 4662 before? Right, it's pretty generic because it's hard to tell. You always have to look it up, right? I got my cheat sheet of events. But event 4662 is whenever an Active Directory query is done on an Active Directory object. Now, in your normal everyday systems, you might have hundreds or thousands of regular Windows Event ID 4662 queries that are legitimate. So how do you detect when you have a rogue person making these queries? Well, what you can do is, say if you have a user, we'll call them Dave. If you see Dave's account making Windows Event ID 4662 across multiple computers, like say hundreds or thousands at a time, well, now you know you have an issue. And this is where correlation and SIM and SOC management and tuning really comes into play here. Because normally by default, your SIM isn't going to really look for this. It's going to look for the standard malware. It's going to look for certain things. But for stuff like this, you kind of have to tune it to your environment, because some environments may legitimately have a lot of this event ID and some might not. You want to look for traffic spikes in Active Directory objects. Again, if it's not normal for that computer to make that many queries, that's something to look into. File share activity is a telltale sign. If there's a lot of file share enumeration by one user account across a lot of computers at once, that's kind of odd. Why is Dave trying to find all the file share locations? Now, a lot of these settings are not default. If you want to look for Windows Event ID 4662 and audit file shares, you have to go in and configure that in your group policies. because they do create additional log data which will have to be stored. Now, a newer idea, and one that I think is probably the most effective, because trying to comb through all those logs is nigh impossible when you have a large environment, is creating what we call honey tokens or honey accounts. Now, honey accounts, if you're familiar with the term honey pots, which are vulnerable computers that you monitor for if anyone tries to attack them, are fake accounts on your network that should never be queried or accessed. So maybe Dave isn't so maybe you have someone in the account, they're not a real Active Directory account, but they're specifically set up so that if an adversary were to query that account, because oftentimes the bad guys will try and grab everything, you have it set up in your SIM or SOC or monitoring tool to say, if anyone tries to access this account, log in as this account, block it immediately. And this is an early warning detection so that you can tell if someone's compromised your network. Because I didn't have it in my original statistics, but the statistic is still almost 6 to 9 months most organizations realize they have been breached. So this helps to tell if your organization has in some way been breached, if your outer defenses have been bypassed. So another tool, and I alluded to this before, is MimiKatz. This started out as most open source tools start. A security enthusiast or professional figured out some unique ways to use PowerShell. They said, PowerShell is really powerful. I wonder what you can do with it. And they figured out in PowerShell, you can actually dump the live password credentials, often in plain text, from memory and extract those passwords. Now, MimiKatz started as just a PowerShell module. This is what it looks like when it runs. It's a command line based program, and it will just dump any of the active credentials that are sitting in memory. It might dump the hash, it might dump the live password, depending on the configuration on the computer. MimiKatz has been a popular tool that a lot of different AV companies talk about trying to defend against, because it's often popular among bad guys to dump passwords. If you can dump all the passwords on a device, gather more credentials, especially an administrator's account, it becomes really difficult to tell, is the person who has access to this machine a normal administrator doing normal functions, or is it a bad guy? People ask me how I evade AV all the time, and I said, once I get a user account, I use remote desktop. Remote desktop doesn't look strange. If I look like Dave and I remote desktop into a computer, they're like, oh, Dave's doing work on that server. Okay. Like there's no question about that. That's why it gets very difficult to tell when user accounts get compromised. How do you tell if it's the real person or a bad guy? Now there's ways to stop MimiKatz, and we've come a long way, but a lot of them are in newer versions of Windows Server. And Windows, if you want to activate Windows Credential Guard, you want to have Windows 10, and you want I believe it's available in Server 2016 and up. It might be available in 2012, but I think it starts at 2016. And what that will do is detect and stop when someone tries to run MimiKatz or a tool similar to it. Anytime that someone tries to access, and I have it there, the last.exe, which is the Windows program that will actually take a copy of the RAM and dump the memories and dump your memory with your credentials, it will attempt to stop it. And Microsoft has come a long way with some of those features. Can you guess how bad guys try and bypass this? They uninstall it. If it's installed on a device and they can uninstall it on a system, restart the system, then steal the credentials. Now that seems rather complicated. You're like, well, they got to go through a lot of steps for that. They do. But remember, a lot of people try and stay in systems for 9 months at a time. So if they can change a group policy setting and get away with it without anyone noticing, all of a sudden that can give them more access. They're out there for the long game. They got $1.5 trillion they're trying to protect and continue to gain. The other thing is monitoring for PowerShell sessions. PowerShell has become almost in some cases more of a liability than a help. While it makes administration extremely easy, it also makes it extremely easy for the adversary to enter and take a lot of information from an environment completely undetected. So bringing it all together, compliance is not the end-all be-all. It's definitely helpful. It has its place. It's helped to secure a lot of organizations and give them a starting roadmap to a better security posture. There's a lot of great recommendations in compliance documentation. Some of them are more broad and they should be more specific. Some of them get real specific where you kind of almost wish they were a little broader because technology might have changed and their recommendation might not be as good as it used to be. It takes people, processes, and technologies to secure an environment, and that's going to change on a daily basis. And then we took a look at some of the common hacking tools that is often used. Now, this was only an example of 2 of them. There's a lot of different ones out there, and a lot of new ones that are always coming out. Just today, some people on my team actually messaged me during this conference about a new tool that they were experimenting with that was better at bypassing antivirus than some of the older tools. It happens all the time. It's a cat and mouse game between the offensive security technologies that adversaries are using and us as defenders. And we have to be on the ball if we want to stop these breaches from continuing and we want to have a safer society. All right, what questions do you have for me? All right, well, that was it. Thank you so much.